The pen is half an inch from the paper. $1.4 billion sits inside that single sheet of ink and promise, waiting for a signature that will change everything. Then a voice comes from the doorway, small, steady, impossible. 9 powerful men in that room go still, the way men go still when something they cannot explain walks in wearing a child's shoes. A boy stands there. 10 years old, he should not be here. He should not know what he knows, but he does. Somewhere in that stack of paper, on a single page buried deep among 400 others, a lie is hiding. A lie worth hundreds of millions of dollars. A lie that traces back 20 years to a decision one man made and never told a living soul. The pen does not move. The room does not breathe. And in the silence, an old debt, long buried, begins to wake up.
The office was empty at 5 in the morning, and Walter Kingston liked it that way. He stood by the window on the 38th floor, a cup of black coffee cooling in his hand, watching the city wake up one light at a time. Below him, the streets of the financial district were still dark. Above him, the sky was starting to turn the color of a bruise healing purple, fading into gray. At 71, Walter had learned that mornings were the only hours that belonged entirely to him. He touched the ring on his left hand. He still wore it 6 years after Eleanor passed, not out of habit, out of something closer to loyalty, a promise that outlived the person it was made to. There was a decision he had made 20 years ago that he had never told another living soul, not his lawyers, not his board, not even Eleanor, who had known almost everything else about him, the way a wife of 40 years comes to know a man better than he knows himself. Today, that decision was going to walk back into his life. He didn't know it yet, but somewhere in the quiet of that morning before the elevator started running and the building filled with voices, something had already been set in motion that he could not stop. Walter set down his coffee and looked at his reflection in the glass. A tired man looked back. Gray beard close and neat, the kind he had worn since Eleanor first told him it suited him better than the clean shave he'd worn for 30 years before that. Eyes that had seen too many boardrooms and buried too many friends. He had built Ashcombe Capital from nothing. 40 years of work. 40 years of being the man other men trusted with their money, their futures, their children's inheritances. His morning routine had not changed in decades. Coffee first black made in the small kitchen down the hall, because he had never trusted the machine in his own office to get it right. Then the window. Then most mornings a walk through the empty floor past the desks that would fill with young analysts within the hour, past the framed photographs on the walls of buildings Ashcombe had once been proud to have a hand in. He had stopped noticing most of those photographs years ago. That morning, for reasons he could not have named, he stopped in front of one he usually walked past without a glance. A groundbreaking ceremony from decades earlier, gold shovels and hard hats, and a much younger Walter standing beside a man he had not spoken to in almost 20 years. He looked at that photograph longer than he meant to, and then he made himself walk on, because in 3 hours he was going to sign the largest deal of his career, and there was no room that morning for old ghosts. He didn't know yet that it was also the deal that would force him to finally look at the one thing he had spent 2 decades trying not to see. The offer had come from Continental Sterling Holdings, a firm out of New York with a reputation for moving fast and paying well. $1.4 billion for a portfolio of industrial properties spread across the eastern seaboard. Warehouses, distribution hubs, land that on paper was worth more than most small countries. The negotiations had taken 4 months. Every clause had been fought over, rewritten, initialed, and rewritten again. Walter had read every summary his team gave him. He had asked hard questions in every meeting. He had sat through consultant presentations that ran long into the evening, had pushed back on valuations that seemed too generous, had insisted on independent verification for every major asset class in the portfolio. He had done everything a careful man does before signing his name to something enormous. Almost everything. There was one document in that 412-page contract that he had not read line by line. A single schedule of properties buried deep in the appendix that his team had assured him was routine. 47 addresses among thousands of pages of terms and covenants and representations, the kind of detail that gets delegated to associates and interns, the kind of page that everyone assumes someone else has already checked. He would think about that later. For now, he finished his coffee, straightened his tie, and walked toward the conference room where his future was waiting for him. Gordon Holloway was already there when Walter arrived, laying out folders on the long mahogany table with the quiet efficiency of a man who had worked for Walter for 11 years and had learned exactly how his boss liked a room prepared. Gordon was the head of legal at Ashcombe Capital, and if you asked anyone in the building, they would tell you Walter trusted him more than almost anyone alive. Gordon had come to Ashcombe straight out of law school, a serious young man with a serious haircut, and Walter had watched him grow into the kind of lawyer who could read a room as well as he could read a contract, which was rarer than people realized. But trust, Walter had learned, was not the same as certainty. "Everything's in order," Gordon said without looking up. "Ellen finished the final review last night. Continental's team lands at 9, signing at 10. And the property schedules, verified against the appraisal reports. Independent firm out of Manhattan. Clean." Gordon paused. "You've asked me that 3 times this week, Walter." "I know. Something bothering you?" Walter looked at the folder sitting closed at the head of the table. 412 pages. A year of his life compressed into paper and ink. "No," he said. "Just an old man's habit of double-checking things." But that wasn't entirely true, and some part of him knew it. There was a feeling sitting in his chest that morning that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not since the last time he had signed something that changed the direction of his life without knowing it. The feeling of standing at the edge of something without seeing the whole shape of it. He would remember that feeling later. He would wish he had listened to it sooner. By 9:45, the conference room was full. Continental Sterling had sent 3 men in Navy suits, all sharp haircuts and expensive watches, along with a younger man carrying a black leather folder embossed with the company crest. Ashcombe's side of the table held 7 people, lawyers and consultants. Walter had assembled over months of preparation, along with Gordon at his right hand and Ellen Kirby 2 seats down, her laptop open, ready to log every word. Ellen had been with the firm 5 years, quiet and precise, the kind of associate who noticed things other people missed because she was too busy trying to look important to actually look carefully. Walter had promoted her twice already and had privately told Gordon he expected to promote her again before the year was out. The younger man from Continental caught Walter's eye as he sat down. There was something about him, something in the way he held himself stiff and careful, like a man trying very hard to look comfortable in a room that made him nervous. His business card, when he slid it across the table, read, "Ryan Coulter, Vice President of Asset Integration." Walter shook his hand. It was cold. "Mr. Coulter," Walter said, "you look like you haven't slept." Ryan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Big day, sir. I'm sure you understand." Walter did understand. He remembered being that age, 30, maybe younger. Standing in rooms full of men twice his age, carrying documents he had barely had time to read, trying to look like he belonged there. He remembered what it felt like to want so badly to be trusted that you would carry almost anything through a door if someone told you it was important. He filed that thought away. He didn't know yet how much it would matter. The meeting moved the way these meetings always move. Slowly then, all at once. There were opening remarks. There were handshakes for the cameras that weren't there, but might as well have been given how carefully everyone performed for the moment. There was a final review of terms that everyone in the room had already memorized, because that is what 4 months of negotiation does to a document. It stops being words and starts being a kind of scripture. Walter listened to Gordon walk through the closing conditions one final time, half his attention on the words and half of it somewhere else entirely on that photograph in the hallway he had stopped in front of that morning without meaning to. And then at 10:14 in the morning, Walter Kingston opened the folder, picked up his silver pen, and prepared to sign his name to the biggest deal of his career. The pen hovered half an inch above the paper. That is when the boy spoke. "Don't sign that paper, sir." The voice was quiet. So quiet that for a moment Walter thought he had imagined it the way a tired mind sometimes invents sounds at the edge of sleep. But then he heard Gordon's chair creak as the man turned. He saw Ellen's fingers freeze above her keyboard. He saw every head in that room turn toward the doorway at the same instant, the way a room turns when something happens that no one has a script for. A boy was standing there. He couldn't have been older than 10. Gray hoodie, a little too big. Jeans that stopped half an inch above his ankles, the kind of length a mother notices before a growth spurt, but hasn't had time to fix yet. His sneakers were clean but old. He was gripping the doorframe with one hand, knuckles pale. He looked, Walter thought, like a child standing at the edge of a swimming pool trying to decide whether the water was safe. "What did you say?" Walter asked. The boy swallowed. When he spoke again, his voice was a little louder, though it still trembled at the edges. "Please don't sign it, sir." "Not yet. There's something on page 247 that isn't right." For a long moment, nobody moved. It was the kind of stillness that settles over a room when 9 grown adults all decide in the same breath not to laugh. Because laughing felt wrong somehow, even though nothing about the situation made sense yet. Across the table, one of the Continental men reached up and straightened his tie. It was such a small gesture, the kind of thing a person does 100 times a day without thinking. But Walter had spent 36 years learning the difference between a man adjusting his tie because he was warm and a man adjusting his tie because something inside him had just gone cold. He set the pen down. He did not know it yet, but that single motion, the quiet click of silver metal against a leather tray, was the last calm decision he would make for several hours. "Son," Walter said carefully, "how did you get up here?" The boy didn't answer. His hand was still pressed against the doorframe. "Page 247, sir," he said instead. "The warehouse properties in Baltimore. One of the addresses on that list. It isn't a warehouse." One of the Ashcombe attorneys began to rise from his seat, already reaching for his phone, already forming the sentence about having security escort the child out. "Sit down," Walter said. He didn't raise his voice. He had not needed to raise his voice in a boardroom in over a decade. The room had long since learned to listen for the quieter register, the way sailors learn to listen for the wind changing before a storm arrives. The lawyer sat. Walter looked at the boy for a long moment. There was something in his eyes that Walter recognized, though it took him a moment to name it. It was the look of someone who has been standing in a doorway for several minutes deciding whether to be brave, and who has already decided. "What's your name?" Walter asked. "Marcus, sir. Marcus Webb." "Marcus." Walter repeated it slowly, the way a man repeats something he wants to remember for the rest of his life, though he did not yet know that this was exactly what he was doing. "I want you to come in. Walk slowly. Nobody in this room is going to hurt you. Come stand beside me and tell me about page 247. The boy hesitated. Walter watched something move behind his eyes, a calculation that no child should have to make, but that some children learn early anyway. The calculation of whether it was safe to walk into a room full of powerful strangers. Then Marcus stepped through the doorway. He crossed the long stretch of pale carpet with slow, deliberate steps, the way someone walks across a stage when nobody has told them where to stand. He stopped beside Walter's chair. Up close, Walter could see the small details that a room full of adults might have missed. The faint ink stain near the cuff of his hoodie, the way his hair had been cut neatly recently, the faint smell of soap like he had washed his hands before walking into a room he wasn't supposed to be in. Walter understood without needing to ask that this boy had wanted to look presentable before he found the courage to speak. He picked up the contract, 412 pages of promises and numbers. He flipped through it until he found page 247. It was a schedule, 47 addresses arranged in 3 neat columns, warehouse facilities, distribution hubs, parcels of industrial land, each one assigned a value between $2 million and $19 million. "Show me," Walter said quietly. Marcus leaned in, careful not to touch the page. His finger hovered over the 7th entry in the 2nd column. "That one, sir. 1847 East Federal Street, Baltimore." The schedule listed it as an 84,000 square foot warehouse valued at $11.2 million. "And it isn't a warehouse?" Walter asked. "No, sir, it's a parking lot. It's been a parking lot since I was little." Marcus took a breath. "My grandmother used to live 2 doors down at 1851. We visited her every Sunday before she passed. There's a fence around that lot now with a sign that says monthly parking. There used to be a building there, but it burned down when I was 4. My mom showed me the spot once when we drove past it." Walter did not move. Across the table, Ryan Coulter reached up and adjusted his tie for the 2nd time. "Mr. Coulter," Walter said without looking away from the page, "would you care to comment on the property at 1847 East Federal Street?" There was a pause that lasted exactly 1 second too long. "Mr. Kingston, our due diligence packet was prepared by an independent appraisal firm. If there's an error on a single line item, I'm sure it's a clerical issue that can be corrected in a side letter at—" "I'm not signing today," Walter said. The room shifted. He felt it more than he saw it. Gordon was already reaching for his phone. The three men from Continental Sterling had gone very still in the particular way that experienced men go still when they sense, without yet understanding why, that the ground beneath them has begun to move. Walter closed the folder gently and set it down. He turned to Marcus, who was standing beside his chair with his hands folded in front of him, the careful posture of a child taught to be small in rooms that were not built for him. "Marcus," Walter said, "I think you'd better sit down. We're going to be here for a while." The Continental team asked for a short recess. Walter granted it. The three men in Navy suits filed out with the stiff posture of people who had already decided without needing to speak to one another that they had phone calls to make in a hallway where no one could overhear them. The door clicked shut. Walter turned to Gordon. "I want every address on page 247 cross-checked against satellite imagery. Everyone, 40 minutes. 40 minutes is 40 minutes, Gordon." Gordon left, taking two consultants with him. That left Walter and Marcus alone at the head of the table, with the gray morning skyline stretching out behind them through the tall windows. Walter turned his chair to face the boy directly. "I'm going to ask you some questions," he said. "Answer them the way you'd answer your mother. You are not in trouble. You will never be in trouble for this. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir." "How did you get up to this floor?" Marcus looked down at his sneakers before answering. "My mom works in the building, sir. She's on the cleaning crew. Today's a teacher work day at my school, so I came with her. She told me to wait in the little room by the security desk and do my reading. I needed the bathroom and the one downstairs was being cleaned, so the guard told me I could use the one up here." He paused, his hands twisting slightly in his lap. "When I came out, there was a man waiting for the elevator. He had a folder that said Continental on it. I remembered because we'd just done a school unit on word roots. Continental from the word for mainland." He glanced toward the door where Ryan Coulter had been standing minutes earlier. "I got in the elevator behind him because the guard said I could ride back down. He pressed 38. I didn't press anything. While we were going up, he opened his folder and started writing something on the back page. He wrote fast." Marcus's voice grew smaller. "The doors started to close after he got out. I don't know why I did it, sir. I put my hand out and stopped them. I followed him." "Why?" Walter asked, though some part of him already suspected the answer. "Because I saw the address on his paper while I was standing behind him in the elevator. 1847 East Federal Street. I knew that street. I knew it wasn't right." He looked up at Walter with eyes that were far too old for a 10-year-old's face. "I thought if he's bringing that into a meeting, somebody in there is going to believe it. So I waited by the water fountain for almost 20 minutes. Then I heard someone say they were starting. I looked in and you were holding the pen." Walter sat with that for a long moment. Outside the window, a flock of pigeons turned together against the gray sky, the way birds do when something invisible moves through them all at once. "Marcus," Walter said finally, "do you understand what you just did?" The boy shook his head slowly. "I don't know if I did anything good, sir. Maybe you already knew, and I just wasted everybody's time. My mom's going to be worried when she can't find me. She told me on my first day we don't bother the people upstairs unless they speak to us first." Walter felt something tighten in his chest that had nothing to do with the 412 pages sitting closed on the table. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," he said. "But you did not bother anyone this morning. What you did may have just saved this company a great deal of money. I don't know how much yet. I'll know within the hour." He leaned forward slightly. "I want you to understand something, and I want you to remember it. The people who matter in a building like this are rarely the ones whose names are on the doors. They're the ones who tell the truth when they see something wrong, even when nobody asks them to look." The boy's eyes went wet at the edges. He nodded once and said nothing, the way some children understand without being told that certain moments don't need an answer. Walter picked up the desk phone. "I'd like to have your mother brought up here," he said. "She's not in any trouble. I want her in this room while we finish sorting this out. Is that all right with you?" "Yes, sir." He dialed the front desk and asked in the same calm voice he used for ordinary requests whether they could locate a member of the cleaning staff named Denise Webb. While he waited for the call to connect, Walter looked down at the closed folder on the table. And for the first time that morning, he let himself think about the thing he had been avoiding since 5 o'clock, standing alone by his office window, and the photograph in the hallway he had lingered in front of without knowing why. 1847 East Federal Street. He knew that street. 20 years ago, when he was 51 years old and Ashcombe Capital was still young enough to need every dollar it could find, Walter had sold off a parcel of land in that exact neighborhood. A quiet transaction handled quickly, the kind of deal a younger and hungrier version of himself had been eager to close without asking too many questions about the buyer. He had not thought about that sale in years. He had trained himself not to. But sitting there now with a 10-year-old boy beside him and a stranger's fraud spread across the table, Walter felt the old unease rise up in his chest like water finding a crack it had been looking for all along. Something had started that morning that went back much further than a boardroom in New York, and he had a growing feeling that before the day was over, he was going to have to look at all of it. The door opened. Gordon stepped back in alone, holding a single sheet of paper. His face had a pallor Walter had seen only twice before in his career, both times in moments that had ended badly for someone across the table. "Walter," Gordon said quietly, "we need to talk, now." Walter rose. He glanced once at Marcus, who was sitting very still with his hands folded, watching the room the way a child watches adults decide something enormous without explaining it to him. "Keep reading, Marcus," Walter said, gently sliding the folder toward him, open to page 247. "Tell me if you recognize any other address on that list. Only if you're certain." Then he followed Gordon into the small private office beside the conference room and closed the door behind them. Gordon set the paper down on the table between them and turned it so Walter could read it. "6 addresses," he said. "Out of 47 on that page, we've confirmed 6 that don't match their descriptions. 2 vacant lots, a residential building, a strip mall under a completely different company name, a public park." He tapped the bottom of the page, "and a church parking lot in Baltimore." He looked up. "The combined misrepresented value on those 6 alone is $63 million. Walter said nothing for a long moment. "How many more do you think there are?" "Honestly, at least a third of that schedule could be fraudulent. We could be looking at somewhere between $180 and $400 million in phantom assets. If this had closed today and the inflation had come out later through an audit or a regulator or a reporter, it wouldn't have been a clerical issue," Walter finished. "No," Gordon said quietly. "It would have been a federal case, and it would have been ours to answer for." Walter walked to the small window and looked out at the river below, the same gray water he had looked at 1,000 mornings before this one. Somewhere beneath the surface of this deal was a decision he had made 20 years ago. He could feel it now the way a man feels weather changing in an old injury. He did not yet know how deep the connection ran. He did not yet know that the person behind this fraud was someone who had once sat across from him at this very table in the earliest days of Ashcombe Capital, back when they had built the company together with nothing but ambition and borrowed money. He would learn that soon enough. For now he turned back to Gordon, and his voice when it came was steady, in the way a man's voice becomes steady only after he has decided something important. "Verify the rest of that schedule," he said. "Every property, every page in this contract, not just the warehouses. If they salted one list, they've salted others. And the Continental team, tell them the closing is suspended, not delayed, suspended. They can collect their materials from the front desk. They are not to come back into this room." Gordon nodded, already turning toward the door. "Gordon," Walter said, and something in his voice made the younger man stop. "Find out who built that asset schedule. Not the messenger. The name of the person whose hands actually put those addresses together." Gordon studied him for a moment, something behind Walter's eyes he had never seen there before in 11 years of working beside him. "You think you know something about this," Gordon said slowly. It wasn't quite a question. Walter looked back out at the river. "I think," he said, "that I made a mistake a long time ago, and it may have finally come looking for me." Gordon waited, but Walter said nothing more. Some doors even a trusted friend cannot ask you to open before you are ready. He left the room to make his calls, and Walter stood alone by the window a while longer, watching the barges move slowly along the water below, carrying weight he could not see toward a destination he could not yet name. Behind him on the other side of the wall, a 10-year-old boy was reading a fraudulent contract, line by line, looking for the truth in a stack of paper that grown men had been too careless or too greedy to find themselves. And somewhere out there in a city Walter had not thought about, in 20 years, an old debt was waiting to be paid. He did not know yet how much that debt would cost him. But standing there with the gray morning light falling across the water, Walter Kingston understood for the first time in a very long while that the life he thought he had left behind him had never actually gone anywhere at all. It had only been waiting. Denise Webb arrived on the 38th floor 11 minutes after the call went out to the front desk. She came through the same door Marcus had stood in an hour earlier, still wearing the gray uniform of the cleaning staff, her hair pulled back in a braid that had started the day neat and had since come slightly loose at one temple. Her hands were folded in front of her tight, the posture of a woman who had been escorted somewhere she did not understand and was bracing herself for whatever came next. "Mr. Kingston," she said before he could speak, "I don't know what my son has done, but whatever it is, Mrs. Webb." Walter crossed the room and extended his hand. "Your son has done nothing wrong. He may have done something extraordinary. Please sit down." She looked at his hand a half-second longer than most people would have. Walter understood that half-second. He had spent enough years around people who had learned the hard way that a rich man's outstretched hand sometimes came with a price attached later. Then she took it. Her grip was firm, the skin rough across the knuckles in the particular way that comes from years of hot water and industrial cleaner, no matter how much lotion a person used at night. He guided her to the chair beside Marcus. The boy looked up from the contract, and something in his face loosened at the sight of his mother, the way a child's shoulders drop when a weight they've been carrying alone finally gets set down. "Mom," he whispered, "I tried to do the right thing." "I know, baby." She didn't know yet what that meant. She put her hand against the back of his neck anyway, the small, private gesture mothers use instead of words, and Walter watched it and thought of his own mother's hand, 60-some years gone now, and how some gestures never leave a person, no matter how old he grows. He told her everything. He told her about the contract, the meeting, the boy standing in the doorway with his hand on the frame. He told her about page 247, about the parking lot listed as a warehouse, about Ryan Coulter's tie, and the color that had drained from Gordon's face when he walked back into the room. He did not soften it. He did not embellish it. He told it the way he had learned across 4 decades to tell hard truths to investors and boards, with the small specific details that make a story impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. When he finished, Denise Webb sat very still. "Mr. Kingston," she said finally, her voice steady in a way that told Walter this was a woman who had learned to keep her voice steady through worse mornings than this one. "I've raised that boy alone for 8 years. His father passed when he was 2. I work this shift, and I work a second one on weekends at a laundry across town. I don't make much money. But I made a promise to my husband before he died, and I've kept it. I promised him I'd raise a son who knew the difference between right and wrong, and who'd choose right even when it cost him something." She looked down at Marcus. "Sounds like he chose right today." "He did," Walter said quietly. "He did." There was a knock at the door. Gordon stepped halfway in, a folder under his arm, his face still carrying the pallor from earlier. "Walter, you'll want to see this." Walter excused himself and stepped into the hallway, leaving Denise and Marcus alone in the conference room, with lunch on its way and 2 attorneys working quietly at the far end of the table. Gordon handed him the folder without a word. Walter opened it and read, 19 properties confirmed fraudulent out of 47 on page 247 alone. Combined phantom value, $217 million. Verification of the remaining schedules in the contract was ongoing, but early findings suggested the same pattern repeated across nearly a dozen other pages. The total when the dust settled would likely land somewhere between $380 and $450 million in assets that did not exist, dressed up to look exactly like assets that did. "There's something else," Gordon said. He pulled a second sheet from the folder and turned it toward Walter. "The satellite cross-check on the Baltimore properties. I had one of the associates pull historical imagery, not just current, going back 20 years. Walter felt something settle in his stomach before he even looked down at the page. 6 of the fraudulent Baltimore addresses, Gordon said, including the one your young friend in there identified, sit inside a 4-block radius. And that radius overlaps almost exactly with a parcel of land that Ashcombe sold off. He checked his notes 20 years ago, according to the file. The room seemed to tilt very slightly, the way a floor does when a man realizes the ground beneath him has never quite been where he believed it was. 20 years ago, Walter said. You'd have been 51, Gordon said, watching him carefully now. I pulled the old file while I was waiting on the imagery. It's thin, thinner than anything else we have from that period. Sold to a shell entity called Harbor Point Development for a fraction of what similar parcels were going for at the time. He paused. Walter, I've worked for you 11 years. I've never seen this file before today. Walter did not answer right away. He was remembering a version of himself he had spent 2 decades trying not to remember. A man in his early 50s, hungry in a different way than he was hungry now, with a young company that needed capital more than it needed a clean conscience. He remembered a meeting in a downtown restaurant, a handshake, a check that had arrived faster than any check in his career before or since. He remembered telling himself at the time that what happened to a piece of land after you sold it was no longer your concern. He had believed that mostly for 20 years. Who bought it? Walter said. It wasn't quite a question. I don't know yet. Harbor Point Development dissolved a number of years later, not long after an insurance settlement closed out on a fire at one of its properties. The trail goes cold there, at least on paper. I've got someone digging into the incorporation records. Walter nodded slowly. He looked at the second sheet again, at the 4-block radius, circled in red at the address that read 1847 East Federal Street, sitting almost exactly in the center of it, like something waiting patiently to be found. Keep digging, he said, quietly. I don't want this connected publicly to Ashcombe until we understand what we're looking at. Gordon studied him for a long moment. Walter, he said carefully, is there something you need to tell me? Walter looked at his friend, his lawyer, the man who had sat beside him through 11 years of deals and disasters and never once asked him a question he didn't have a right to ask. Not yet, Walter said. Give me time to understand it myself first. He walked back into the conference room a few minutes later and found lunch had arrived. Sandwiches, coffee, a carton of milk for Marcus that the boy was drinking with the quiet seriousness of someone determined not to spill it in a room this important. Denise looked up as he entered. Whatever she saw in his face made her set down her sandwich. Mr. Kingston, are you all right? Long morning, Mrs. Webb, Walter said, and managed something close to a smile. Nothing that won't keep. But it would not keep, and some part of him already knew it. The afternoon moved the way afternoons move when a company is quietly coming apart and putting itself back together at the same time. Ellen Kirby ran point on the verification cross-referencing property after property against public records. Tax filings, satellite imagery, going back as far as the databases allowed. She worked through lunch without touching the sandwich Walter had ordered for her, the particular focus of someone who understood without being told exactly how much weight this afternoon carried. By 3 o'clock, the number of confirmed fraudulent properties had climbed past 24. By 4, Gordon had a preliminary conversation with Margaret Liu at the SEC's Enforcement Division, careful and unofficial, the kind of call that plants a flag without yet raising an alarm. Walter sat through most of it in the small private office beside the main conference room, the door half open, listening to updates as they came, and thinking about a name he had not let himself think about in a very long time. Franklin Meade. They had built Ashcombe Capital together in a rented office above a dry cleaner, back when Walter was 34 and Franklin was 31, and neither of them owned a suit that fit quite right. Franklin had been the one with the instincts for land, for warehouses, for the unglamorous industrial deals that nobody else wanted to touch. Walter had been the one who could sit across from a banker and make him believe in something that didn't exist yet. They had been for the better part of a decade closer than brothers. Walter remembered nights spent in that rented office long after the dry cleaner downstairs had closed for the evening, the two of them arguing over spreadsheets by the light of a single desk lamp. Franklin's laugh carrying down the empty hallway loud enough that the janitor used to knock on the door just to make sure everything was all right. He remembered Franklin standing beside him at his wedding to Eleanor, the best man's toast that had made half the room cry and the other half laugh so hard they had to set down their glasses. And then the year after the Harbor Point sale, Franklin had walked out of Ashcombe Capital in a silence so complete that Walter had never learned the full reason for it. Not really. There had been a disagreement over strategy. There had been, Walter suspected even now, something deeper that neither of them had ever said out loud. Franklin Meade had taken his share of the company's early profits and disappeared from Walter's life almost entirely. A card at Eleanor's funeral 6 years ago with no note beyond a signature. Nothing else in nearly 2 decades. Walter had told himself over the years that this was simply what happened to old partnerships. People grew in different directions. Ambition cooled or curdled or found new shapes. He was beginning to suspect, sitting in that small office, with the afternoon light slanting through the single window, that he had been telling himself a comfortable story instead of the true one. At 4:30, Gordon knocked and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "We have a name," he said, "on the incorporation records for Harbor Point Development. It took some digging because the original filing used a registered agent to keep the principals off the public record. But we found the agent's client list from an unrelated bankruptcy filing several years later. He set a single page on the desk. Walter looked down at it. He did not need to read the name to know what it would say. Some part of him had known since Gordon first showed him the 4-block radius on East Federal Street. Some part of him, if he was honest, had known since he stood in the hallway that morning, looking at a photograph he usually walked past without a glance. Franklin Meade. Walter sat with it for a long moment, the way a man sits with a diagnosis he has already suspected, but has not yet allowed himself to confirm. "He bought the land from us," Walter said quietly, "20 years ago, through a shell company. And then it looks like the building on it burned nearly 14 years later," Gordon said. "The same fire your young friend in the other room mentioned. The one that took the building down when he was 4, which puts it right around 6 years ago now." Walter closed his eyes briefly. "Insurance payout on that fire went to a holding company 2 steps removed from Harbor Point," Gordon continued. "We're still tracing it, but the pattern is starting to look familiar. Buy land cheap, let a building sit for years, mostly empty, mostly forgotten. Then when the moment is right, let something happen to it and dress the land back up on paper as something far more valuable than it is. And fold it into a much larger transaction where nobody has time to look closely at property 41 of 47 on page 247. And 20 years later," Walter said slowly, "he tries to sell it back into my own company." Gordon didn't answer that. He didn't need to. "Walter," he said instead, "I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly, because if this goes to the SEC, it's going to come up eventually, and I would rather hear it from you than read it in a filing." Walter looked at him. "Did you know 20 years ago what Harbor Point Development actually was?" The question hung in the small room for a moment. Walter thought about lying. It would have been easy. Gordon had no way of proving otherwise, not yet, and the truth was messier than a simple denial. But he was 71 years old, and he had spent the morning listening to a 10-year-old boy explain without hesitation that he had walked into a room full of powerful strangers because he could not stand the thought of a lie succeeding simply because no one else had bothered to look closely enough to stop it. "No," Walter said. "I didn't know what it was, but I didn't ask either. And there's a difference between not knowing and not wanting to know, Gordon. And I think I've spent 20 years pretending there wasn't." Gordon absorbed that in silence. "I sold that land because the company needed cash, and the offer came in fast, and I didn't ask enough questions about the buyer because I didn't want the answers to slow things down," Walter said. "I told myself it wasn't my business what happened to it after. I believed that mostly for a long time. And now," Walter looked out the small window at the gray line of the river. "Now I think what happened to that land has been circling back toward me for 20 years, waiting for the moment I'd least be able to avoid it." Gordon was quiet for a long moment. "This changes the report to the SEC," he said finally, not unkindly. "If Ashcombe's own history is tangled up in the origin of these properties, even at a step removed, it needs to be disclosed. You know that." "I know that. It could look bad, regardless of what actually happened. The optics of the chairman's old land sale sitting at the center of a fraud, his own company nearly absorbed." "I know that too, Gordon." Walter's voice was steady, but something in it had changed since the morning some weight settled into it that had not been there when he stood by his office window at 5 o'clock, thinking he understood exactly what kind of day this was going to be. "Give me the evening," Walter said. "I want to think about how to do this the right way, not the fast way." Gordon nodded and left him alone with the river in the gray light in 20 years of a decision he had never told another living soul. The evening did not give him the quiet he was hoping for. At 6:15, Ellen Kirby knocked on the door of the small office, her face carrying a particular tightness that Walter had learned over the years to associate with bad news arriving faster than anyone wanted it to. "Mr. Kingston, there's a call. It's someone from Continental Sterling's outside counsel. He's asking for you specifically, not Gordon." Walter took the call at his desk in the small office, the door closed. The voice on the other end was smooth, in the particular way of a man who had spent a career learning to sound reasonable while saying something entirely unreasonable. "Mr. Kingston, I'll keep this brief out of respect for your time. My clients understand there have been some discrepancies identified in the property schedules. They're prepared to be fully cooperative in resolving this matter quietly through amendment, without the need for regulatory involvement." "Quietly," Walter repeated. "We believe that serves everyone's interests, including Ashcombe's. My clients are aware, Mr. Kingston, of certain historical transactions involving a parcel on East Federal Street. Transactions dating back some years involving a company called Harbor Point Development. A pause, deliberate and unhurried. We'd hate for an examination of our current dealings to necessitate a broader examination of the property's full history. That would be uncomfortable for everyone at the table, yourself included. Walter sat very still. Are you threatening me? He asked, his voice quiet in the way that had made grown men sit back down in boardrooms for 14 years. I'm simply suggesting, Mr. Kingston, that there may be a version of this resolution that serves both our interests and one that serves neither. My clients would prefer the former. I suspect upon reflection you might as well. The line went quiet, waiting. Walter looked out at the darkening river, the lights of the city beginning to come up along the water like something waking from a long sleep. 20 years ago, a younger and more frightened version of himself might have taken the offer being extended to him now. Might have found a way to make the problem disappear quietly, the way the problem had been made to disappear once before, back when Harbor Point Development was nothing more than a name on a check that had arrived faster than any check in his career. I appreciate the call, Walter said finally, but I think you should know something about how I intend to spend what's left of my career. Mr. Kingston, I've spent 40 years building a company on the idea that the truth costs less in the long run than the lie does, even when it doesn't feel that way in the moment it's told. I made a mistake 20 years ago. I don't fully understand the shape of it yet, but I intend to find out, and I intend to report what I find, whatever it costs me personally. That includes anything your clients think they can use against me. There was a long silence on the line. You understand what that could mean for your reputation, the voice said, finally quieter now, some of the smoothness gone out of it. I understand, Walter said, that my reputation has already survived worse than the truth. Good evening. He set the phone down gently, the way he had set down the silver pen that morning, a small motion carrying far more weight than its size suggested. He sat alone in the small office for a long time after that, the city lights climbing slowly up the darkening glass, and he found himself thinking not about Continental Sterling or the SEC or the number that Gordon had shown him earlier, $400 million in fraud, sitting at the center of his career's largest deal. He was thinking about Franklin Meade. He was thinking about a version of the two of them, 30 years younger, sitting in a rented office above a dry cleaner, splitting a single sandwich between them because neither one could afford lunch that week, laughing about something neither of them would remember by morning. He was trying to understand how that version of Franklin had become the man on the other end of a fraud that had, in some crooked and roundabout way, walked all the way back to Walter's own front door. He did not yet have an answer, but he suspected, sitting there in the dark, that he was going to have to ask Franklin himself. Marcus and Denise stayed until early evening. Walter came to check on them twice more, and each time found the boy quieter than the last, the long day finally settling into his small shoulders, the way exhaustion settles into a child who has been carrying something heavier than his age for far too many hours. At one point, Marcus fell asleep, sitting up in his chair, his head tipping slowly toward his mother's shoulder, and Denise sat very still so as not to wake him, watching him with an expression Walter recognized from his own years as a young father decades ago, before the company had grown large enough to eat most of his evenings whole. We should get him home, Denise said gently around 6:30, smoothing a hand over her son's hair. It's been a lot for one day. Of course, Walter said. I have a car waiting downstairs. My driver will take you home and he'll wait until you're safely inside. He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. Mrs. Webb, I want to be honest with you about something because I think you deserve honesty more than comfort right now. The people connected to what your son found this morning are not small people. They have a great deal of money and now a great deal to lose. I don't believe they would ever consider harming a child. I don't think it would even occur to them. But I haven't built a company for 40 years by assuming the best about people I've just caught committing fraud. Something flickered across Denise's face, quick and controlled, the look of a woman doing careful math about a danger she hadn't considered until this exact moment. So we're going to be careful, Walter continued. Just careful. My driver will give you a number you can reach at any hour for the next several weeks. Nothing more than that. I don't say this to frighten you. I say it because I'd rather you know and be prepared than not know and be caught by surprise. Denise absorbed this in silence, her hand still resting on Marcus's shoulder. All right, Mr. Kingston, she said finally. We'll be careful. Walter walked them to the elevator himself. Marcus, half asleep on his feet by then, looked up at him with the drowsy seriousness of a child fighting exhaustion. "Mr. Kingston," he said, "did I do something wrong coming in like that?" Walter crouched down an old man's knees, protesting the motion until he was level with the boy's tired eyes. "Marcus, you did something very right. I want you to sleep well tonight and not worry about any of this. The worrying is my job now. Do you understand?" The boy nodded, and something in his face relaxed for the first time all day. Walter watched the elevator doors close on the two of them and stood alone in the hallway for a long moment afterward, thinking about how strange it was that the most honest conversation he'd had all day had been with a 10-year-old boy and his exhausted mother, rather than with any of the lawyers, consultants, or executives who had filled his conference room since 10 o'clock that morning. He went back to his office. It was nearly 8. He sat at his desk alone, the city fully lit now beyond the window, and pulled out a personal phone he rarely used for business, the one whose number had not changed in over 20 years. He scrolled through it slowly until he found a name he had not called in nearly a decade. Franklin Meade. His thumb hovered over the call button the way his pen had hovered over the contract that morning. Half an inch of empty space standing between the world as he understood it and the world as it actually was. He thought about Eleanor and what she would have told him to do. She had always been better than him at knowing which conversations could not wait no matter how much they cost. He thought about the SEC and the report he had promised Margaret Liu he would make within 72 hours. He thought about Gordon's question still hanging unanswered in the small office down the hall. He thought about the boy in the doorway and the courage it must have taken to walk toward a truth that terrified him simply because walking away from it felt worse. Walter Kingston pressed the call button. It rang 4 times before it picked up. There was a long pause on the other end, the particular silence of 2 men who have not spoken in years but recognize each other's breathing anyway. "Walter," the voice said finally, older now, roughened by time, in a way Walter's own voice had roughened too. "I wondered how long it would take you to figure it out." Walter closed his eyes. "Franklin," he said quietly, "we need to talk. Tonight, if you're willing." "I've been willing for 20 years, Franklin said. "You're the one who took his time getting here." The line went quiet between them, thick with everything neither man had said in almost 2 decades. And somewhere out beyond the tall windows of Walter's office, the city kept moving the way it always did, indifferent to the 2 old men and the old debt finally coming due between them. Walter looked down at his own hands on the desk, the hands of a 71-year-old man who had spent the morning learning that the past does not stay buried simply because a person decides not to dig it up. "Where are you?" he asked. "Closer than you think," Franklin said. "I've been closer than you think for longer than you'd like to know." And with that, the second half of Walter Kingston's day began, one that would carry him not toward the closing he had expected that morning, but toward a reckoning with the one debt in his life he had never found the courage to pay. Franklin Meade was waiting for him in the lobby of a small hotel on the edge of the financial district, the kind of place with tired carpet and a doorman who had stopped expecting anything interesting to happen on his shift years ago. Walter recognized him before he saw his face. It was something in the way the man sat shoulders squared, even in stillness, one leg crossed over the other with the particular patience of someone who had been waiting a long time and had made peace with waiting longer. 20 years had turned Franklin's dark hair to gray and added lines around eyes that had once looked at Walter across a card table with nothing but ambition and easy laughter. Now those same eyes looked tired, tired in a way that went deeper than one bad night. "You look older," Franklin said as Walter lowered himself into the chair across from him. "So do you." 20 years will do that." Neither man moved to shake hands. The distance between the 2 chairs felt to Walter like it had been measured carefully by something neither of them could see. "I ordered you a coffee," Franklin said, nodding toward a cup on the low table between them. "Black, no sugar, some things I remember." Walter looked at the cup but didn't touch it. Why the fraud, Franklin, after everything? Why this? Franklin exhaled slowly, the kind of breath a man releases when he has rehearsed an answer for years and finally has somewhere to put it. "You want the honest version or the version I've been telling myself? I've had enough of the second kind today." Franklin nodded slowly, looking down at his own hands. "When I left Ashcombe the year after we sold that land," he said, "I told you it was about strategy, different visions for the company. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." He looked up. "The whole truth is that I found out that year what really happened to the East Federal Street property. I found out what Harbor Point Development was, and I found out you'd signed off on the sale without ever asking who was really buying it. Walter felt something cold settle in his chest. I didn't know. I know you didn't know, Franklin said, cutting him off not unkindly. That's exactly the problem, Walter. You didn't know because you didn't ask. And I was the one who'd brought the buyer to the table in the first place. I was young and hungry, and I needed the deal to close as badly as you did. So I didn't ask enough questions either. But I found out afterward what that land became. What happened to the building on it years later. Who got hurt when it burned. His voice tightened. A family lived 2 doors down from that building. I found that out later, too. A woman and her young daughter. The girl grew up, had a boy of her own eventually. I imagine you've met him by now. Walter's breath caught. Marcus, he said quietly. Franklin nodded. I've been watching that family from a distance for longer than you'd believe, Walter. Not to hurt them, to understand what I'd been part of. What we'd been part of without ever meaning to be. Then why, Walter said, his voice rising for the first time, would you build an entire fraud scheme around that same neighborhood, around the same street, if you understood what happened there? Franklin's jaw tightened. Because I wanted you to see it, he said. I wanted you to finally look at it. Walter, the way I've had to look at it every day for 20 years. I built the scheme to route back through Ashcombe through your own deal because I knew that eventually, if I was patient enough, it would land back on your table. And you'd have to choose. Sign it blind the way you signed the original sale blind. Or finally look closely enough to see what you'd been part of all along. The lobby around them seemed to grow very quiet. You could have just called me, Walter said. 20 years ago. You could have told me what you found. We could have made it right together. Could we have? Franklin's voice cracked slightly. You were the golden name in this city by then, Walter. Ashcombe Capital rising fast, everyone's favorite success story. What would you have done back then if I'd walked into your office and told you the land you sold cheap to keep the company afloat became a fraud that hurt real families? Would you have stopped everything to fix it, or would you have found a quiet way to make the problem disappear? The same way you made the questions about the buyer disappear the day you signed. Walter opened his mouth to answer and found to his own quiet horror that he wasn't certain what the honest answer would have been. I don't know, he admitted finally. I'd like to believe I would have done the right thing. But I can't promise you I would have back then. I'm not the same man I was at 51. Something in Franklin's shoulders loosened slightly at that admission, as though he had been waiting 20 years not for an apology, but for exactly that kind of honesty. No, Franklin said quietly. None of us are, if we're lucky. They sat with that for a long moment, 2 old men in a tired hotel lobby carrying between them a debt that had taken 2 decades and a 10-year-old boy's courage to finally come due. What happens now? Walter asked. Franklin looked at him steadily. Now you do what I built this whole thing hoping you'd do if I'm honest, he said. You report it, all of it. My part, your part, the sale, the fraud, the fire, everything. You don't protect either one of us. You let it land where it lands. You built a scheme that could put you in prison hoping I'd be the one to turn you in. I built a scheme, Franklin said slowly, hoping that somewhere along the way it would force both of us to stop looking away from something we'd spent 20 years avoiding. I'm not proud of the method, Walter. I've had a long time to sit with what it cost other people. Ryan Coulter, for one. That boy didn't deserve to be pulled into this. I used a young man's need for approval the same way this whole business used mine once. Walter studied his old friend's face and saw for the first time since sitting down, not a criminal, not an enemy, but a man who had spent 20 years carrying a weight he had never found a way to put down cleanly. I'm going to call Margaret Liu at the SEC tonight, Walter said. I'm going to tell her everything. My history with the land, your history with the fraud, all of it. I'm not going to protect myself and I'm not going to protect you. Good, Franklin said, and something like relief passed briefly across his tired face. That's exactly what should happen. Walter rose from his chair. He looked down at his old partner, at the years written into his face, at the strange and painful loyalty that had brought this man to build an elaborate scheme simply to force a reckoning neither of them had been brave enough to start any other way. I don't forgive you for the families you hurt along the way, Walter said. I want you to know that plainly. I don't expect you to, Franklin said. I don't forgive myself for it either. But I understand, Walter continued more quietly. What it is to carry something for 20 years and not know how to set it down. I understand that better today than I did yesterday. Franklin nodded once, and neither man said anything more. Walter turned and walked out of the tired lobby into the cool night air and did not look back, though some part of him understood he would carry the shape of that conversation for whatever years he had left. He called Margaret Liu at 11 that night and told her everything. Not the summary Gordon had prepared, not the careful language his lawyers would have chosen. He told her about a 51-year-old man who needed cash badly enough to stop asking questions about a shell company he should have investigated, and hadn't, about a fire that had taken a building and nearly taken a family with it, about a 10-year-old boy who had walked into a boardroom that morning and forced an old man to finally look at something he had spent 2 decades looking away from. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, there was a long pause on the line. "Mr. Kingston," she said finally, "most people in your position call me with a story that protects themselves first and discloses the truth second, if at all. You just did the opposite." "I'm 71 years old," Walter said simply. "I don't have the years left to waste protecting a version of myself I no longer respect." "The self-reporting will matter," Margaret said. "It won't erase your role in the original transaction, but it matters a great deal both legally and otherwise that you came to us before we came to you." "That's not why I called." "I believe you," Margaret said, and there was something almost gentle in her voice. "That's precisely why it will matter." He sat by his window a long while after that call ended, the city fully quiet now beneath him, and thought about the photograph in the hallway he had lingered in front of that morning without knowing why. He understood it now. Some part of him had known this day was coming long before Marcus Webb ever stood in his doorway. The weeks that followed moved with the particular speed that thorough preparation buys a person when it collides with a moment of crisis. Ryan Coulter was interviewed extensively, first by Ashcombe's legal team, then by federal investigators. What emerged was not the picture of a willing fraudster, but of a young man drowning in a family debt he had never told anyone about, recruited quietly by people above him who understood exactly how to make a frightened 30-year-old feel useful, trusted, and trapped all at once. The story, when it came out fully, was simpler and sadder than anyone had expected. Ryan's father had fallen seriously ill 2 years earlier, and the medical debt had piled up faster than a young man earning a mid-level salary could ever hope to manage. A senior partner at Continental Sterling, aware of the situation, had offered a solution that seemed at the time almost generous. A modest loan quietly arranged with an understanding that Ryan would prove useful in return someday, in whatever small way was needed. By the time that someday arrived, Ryan was too deep in debt and too frightened of losing his position to say no. Walter made a decision about Ryan that surprised even Gordon. "I want you to speak with the prosecutor's office on his behalf," Walter told him in the small office where so much of that first terrible day had unfolded. "Not to excuse what he did, to explain the position he was placed in. There's a difference between the architect of a fraud and the courier who was too frightened to walk away from one." "That's generous, Walter, given the circumstances." "It isn't generosity," Walter said. "It's honesty. I was 34 once, too hungry enough to sign things I shouldn't have. Somebody should have looked closely enough to see the difference in me back then. Nobody did. I'd like to be the kind of man who does that for someone else, even now. Especially now." Ryan Coulter avoided prison. He pleaded to a lesser charge, cooperated fully, and began slowly the long work of rebuilding a life that had nearly been consumed by a debt inherited from people he had trusted too easily. Walter learned months later that Ryan had found work in a small firm outside the city, far from the kind of boardroom where a young man's need to be trusted could once again be used against him. Franklin Meade did not avoid consequences and did not ask to. He pleaded guilty to fraud charges connected to the falsified asset schedules and to a related charge concerning the original concealment of Harbor Point Development's true ownership 20 years earlier. His sentence, when it came, reflected both the seriousness of what he had built and the extraordinary degree of cooperation he offered from the very beginning, including financial records that helped investigators trace the harm done to other families along that same 4-block radius in Baltimore, families whose names had never made it into any conference room, but whose losses were just as real as the numbers on page 247. Walter visited him once before the sentencing. They sat across a table in a small visiting room and said very little. There was nothing left to argue about, and everything left unsaid between two old men who had once split a single sandwich in a rented office above a dry cleaner, believing the whole world was still ahead of them. "Thank you," Franklin said near the end of the visit, for finally looking at it. Walter didn't answer right away. "I wish you'd found a kinder way to make me look," he said finally. "So do I," Franklin said quietly. "I don't think I knew a kinder way by the time I understood what I needed to do." Walter Kingston's own reckoning came before the Ashcombe board 6 weeks after that first morning in the conference room. He stood without notes and told them the same story he had told Margaret Liu on the phone that first terrible night. The land sale, the willful blindness, the fraud that had circled back 20 years later to nearly destroy the very company he had built to prove that willful blindness was a mistake he would never make again. The board was silent when he finished. "I understand," Walter said into that silence, "that some of you will question whether a man capable of that kind of carelessness 20 years ago should still be sitting at the head of this table today. I've asked myself the same question every day for 6 weeks. I don't have a comfortable answer for you. What I have is this: I built this company on the idea that the truth costs less over time than the lie, even when it hurts more in the moment it's told. I nearly forgot that lesson once. I do not intend to forget it again for whatever years I have left to lead this company, or any that follow after I'm gone." He looked around the table slowly at faces he had known for years, some kind, some carefully unreadable. "I'll accept whatever the board decides," he said, "but I wanted you to hear the whole truth from me first before it arrived through anyone else's account of it." The board deliberated for 3 days. They asked Walter to remain as chairman, with new oversight structures put in place around every future major transaction structures Walter himself had proposed before they were ever asked of him. "You built the company on trust," one of the longest-serving board members told him privately after the vote. "What you did wrong 20 years ago was trust too little in the wrong direction and too much in the wrong people. What you did right this year was finally learn the difference." Walter thought about that sentence for a long time afterward. There was one more piece of unfinished business Walter carried with him through those difficult weeks, one that had nothing to do with boards or prosecutors or federal filings. On a quiet Saturday morning in late autumn, he drove to Baltimore alone, without his usual driver, without Gordon, without anyone from the company. He parked his car near the corner of East Federal Street across from a small shop with a faded sign that read, "Wallace's," the kind of corner store that had likely watched 3 generations of a neighborhood grow up and move on. He walked the half block to 1847 East Federal Street and stood in front of the chain-link fence looking at the empty lot that had once been a warehouse on paper, a parking lot in reality, and years before that a building that had burned down while a 4-year-old boy watched from somewhere nearby, too young yet to understand what he was losing. A sign on the fence still read "Monthly Parking," faded and peeling at one corner. Walter stood there for a long time, an old man in a wool coat on a cold morning, looking at an empty lot that had cost him in one form or another 20 years of a quiet unease he had never fully named until a 10-year-old boy forced him to. He thought about the version of himself who had signed away this land without asking enough questions, hungry for a check that had arrived faster than any check in his career before or since. He thought about Franklin, 31 years old, and just as hungry, bringing a buyer to the table because the deal needed to close and neither of them wanted to slow it down by asking who they were really doing business with. He thought about the family 2 doors down who had lost more than a building when it burned, and about how easily, how casually 2 ambitious young men had let that loss become someone else's problem to grieve alone. "I'm sorry," Walter said quietly to no one, to the empty lot, to the fence, to 20 years of looking away. It did not undo anything. He understood that. Some debts cannot be repaid simply by finally acknowledging them. But something in his chest loosened slightly, standing there in the cold, the way a knot loosens after being pulled tight for so long that the body forgets eventually what it feels like to be untied. An elderly woman came out of Wallace's across the street pulling a small wheeled cart behind her and gave him a curious glance, the kind reserved for a stranger in an expensive coat standing very still in a neighborhood not used to seeing men like him. Walter nodded to her, the small, polite gesture he had given to 1,000 strangers over the years, and then for the first time in longer than he could remember, he made himself hold her gaze a moment longer than the nod required, and said good morning and meant it. She seemed surprised and then briefly pleased. She nodded back and continued on her way. Walter stood a while longer watching the quiet street, an elderly man in a wool coat, in a neighborhood far from the tall glass towers where he had spent most of his adult life. Then he turned and walked slowly back to his car and drove home with the window cracked slightly, letting the cool November air move through the space where 20 years of silence had lived. The Educational Trust for Marcus Webb was established on a Friday in early December in Gordon Holloway's modest downtown office rather than in the polished conference room where the whole story had begun. Walter had insisted on the smaller setting. "This isn't a business transaction," he told Gordon when the arrangements were being made. "I don't want it to feel like one. I want it to feel like what it is." Denise sat beside her son at a small round table, her hands folded in her lap, watching Walter with an expression that had softened considerably in the weeks since that first frightening morning, though the careful wariness never fully left her eyes, and Walter understood by then that it likely never would, and that this was not something to be fixed, only respected. "Mrs. Webb," Walter said, "I want to say something before we go any further, because I think it matters more than the paperwork does." She nodded, waiting. "I am not offering you charity," Walter said. "I don't believe in charity, not in the way the word usually gets used. I'm offering a return on an investment your son already made with nothing but his own conscience and his own courage. If a grown man had done what Marcus did that morning, I'd already have written him a check large enough to change the rest of his life. The fact that the man in question is 10 years old doesn't change the math. It only changes the form the payment takes." He looked at Marcus. "I want to establish a trust in your name," Walter said, "fully funded today, that pays for any school you want to attend for as long as you want to attend one. Elementary, high school, college, whatever comes after, if that's the road you choose. It will be managed by a board that includes your mother and a lawyer of her choosing, paid for by me, but working entirely for her. I won't sit on that board. I won't have access to those funds. If I'm gone tomorrow, the trust continues exactly as it stands today." He paused. "I'm telling you this in front of your mother because I want you to understand something for the rest of your life, Marcus. This isn't a favor from an old man who happened to like you. It's a consequence of something you did. Good actions have consequences the same way bad ones do, and I don't want you growing up believing the only reward for doing right is a private one nobody else ever sees." Denise looked at her son. "What do you think, baby?" Marcus considered the question carefully, the same unhurried seriousness Walter remembered from that first morning when the boy had pointed at page 247 without touching the paper and said that one "sir" with the quiet certainty of someone who understood exactly how much weight those two words carried. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "if what I did was really worth that much, then this isn't like taking something. It's like when mom picks up an extra shift at the laundry and they pay her extra for it. It's just the world being fair for once." Denise closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, there was something in her face Walter didn't have an easy name for, though he suspected it was the particular look of a mother hearing her son say, without prompting, exactly the lesson she had spent 10 years quietly trying to teach him, and discovering in the saying of it that it had finally landed. "We accept," she said, turning back to Walter, "on one condition. Name it. He keeps coming with me on the days I work. I don't want him disappearing into some private school where he forgets where he came from. He can go to a better school, we'll talk about which one. But on the days there's no school, he sits with me. He reads his book. He says good morning to Mr. Dale at the front desk. He doesn't become a different boy because of this. He becomes the same boy with a longer road ahead of him." Walter nodded slowly. "That is exactly the right condition, Mrs. Webb. I would have been disappointed if you hadn't asked for it." "Then we have a deal," she said, and did not extend her hand. This time simply said the words themselves, the way working people seal agreements in kitchens and on porches, trusting the word alone to carry more weight than any signature ever could. Walter understood, sitting there in Gordon's modest office in early December, that her word was worth more to him than the 412 pages he had nearly signed without reading closely enough months earlier. Spring came eventually, the way it always does, indifferent to how much had changed in the months before it arrived. Marcus enrolled that following September at a small independent school with a strong math program and a tuition policy the trust covered in full. He continued coming with his mother on the days there was no school, reading quietly in the small room near the security desk, greeting Mr. Dale by name every single morning, the same careful, serious boy he had always been, simply carrying a longer road ahead of him now. His teachers in the reports Denise proudly kept in a folder on the kitchen counter described a boy who asked careful, thoughtful questions, who noticed things other children missed, who had, according to one especially fond note from his homeroom teacher, an unusual gift for sitting with a hard problem until it finally gave up its answer rather than rushing toward the nearest convenient one. Denise Webb accepted Walter's offer to cover the mortgage on a small two-bedroom house in a quieter neighborhood with better schools and a shorter walk to the bus stop. She did not, however, leave her cleaning job at Ashcombe Capital. Why keep it? Walter asked her once on the porch of the new house on a warm evening the following spring, when you don't need to anymore. She looked at him for a long moment before answering. Because I'm good at it, Mr. Kingston, she said. And because I want my son to remember there's no work beneath the dignity of the person who does it well. Walter drove home that evening, thinking about that sentence for a long time, turning it over the way a man turns over something valuable he's afraid of setting down too carelessly. He changed in the months that followed in ways that surprised the people who had known him longest. He read every page of every contract he signed, without exception, for the rest of his career, no matter how long it took, no matter how many meetings it delayed. He learned the names of the cleaning crew. He learned the names of the security guards, the maintenance staff, the people who kept the building running quietly in the hours before the offices filled with the kind of people whose names appeared in the financial pages. He stopped offering the small, polite nod he had once given for decades to people whose names he had never bothered to learn because he had come to understand slowly and at real cost that the nod, however courteous it appeared, was a small daily act of looking past someone rather than truly looking at them. On the first anniversary of that morning in the conference room, Walter invited Denise and Marcus to a small dinner, nothing grand at a quiet restaurant a few blocks from the office. Gordon came too, and Ellen Kirby, who had by then been promoted twice more exactly as Walter had once told Gordon he expected. Franklin's name did not come up that evening, though Walter thought of him more than once sitting there among the people whose lives had been rearranged for better and for worse, by a decision he had made 20 years earlier without asking enough questions. Marcus, 11 years old by then and taller than he had been the year before, asked Walter if he still had the silver pen. "I do," Walter said. "Do you still use it?" "Every time," Walter said. "But I read every page first now. Every single one." Marcus nodded, satisfied the way a boy nods when a grown man finally learns a lesson the boy has already understood for as long as he can remember. There are stories people tell themselves about who matters in a room and who doesn't, about whose voice carries weight and whose voice fades quietly into the background, about which lives a person is required to notice and which ones they are permitted to walk past without a second thought. Most of those stories Walter came to understand are wrong. The most important person in any given room is rarely the one whose name sits on the door. Sometimes it's a 71-year-old man finally willing to look at a mistake he made 20 years earlier. Sometimes it's a 10-year-old boy in a faded gray hoodie standing in a doorway deciding whether to be brave. Pay attention to the small voices. Learn the names of the people who clean your building, who guard your lobby, who hand you your coffee in the morning without expecting to be seen in return. The truth, when it finally arrives, rarely walks in wearing a suit. Sometimes it arrives quietly half an inch above a signature line, waiting patiently for someone old enough to know better and brave enough to finally stop and listen.